Well, I'm not a betting man, but don't you think the odds are stacked against us? From the moment we're born, the odds are not great. Think of it. 1 in 2 of us will have cancer at some time in our lives. 1 in 5 of us will face depression by our later years. 2 in 5 of us will see our marriages break up. And that's before you get anywhere near car accidents, robberies, burglary, flooding, and of course the ultimate statistic, 1 in 1 of us will die, and others will be left to grieve. The odds are stacked against us. Live long enough and we will suffer. And for Christians, if anything, the odds are worse. Add to all that rejection from family or work colleagues who think you've gone religious. Think of the battles against temptations, the habits that others probably wouldn't even worry about. And how do we hold on to faith in God's goodness when sometimes there seems so much evidence against it? And now, friends, to add to it all, the threat of coronavirus, the unseen enemy, picking us off one by one, putting us out of jobs or maybe out of business, trapping us in our own 4 walls. So yes, hard though it is, suffering is coming and the odds are not great. And that is why it is so good and so important to be here for this hour of the cross in 2020. In a suffering world, how we need the cross. And it is no accident that the cross has dominated Mark's Gospel. If you've been with us on this journey through our sermon series over recent months, you've seen this. The first 7 chapters are mainly Jesus bursting on the scene with amazing power and authority. Everyone is asking, who is this man? And then the penny drops in chapter 8 as Peter bursts out, you are the Christ, God's chosen King. And then the story continues, chapters 8 to 16, and the story turns. The next 8 chapters are all about conflict and the cross. Conflict and the cross for Jesus, conflict and the cross for his apprentices, for you and me. That is why so many students of Mark's Gospel think that it was written for Christians in Rome under the Emperor Nero, because so many of those our foremothers and forefathers in the faith were tortured and killed. It is a gospel of the cross for a people of the cross. The famous preacher John Stott once said this, "The cross is the blazing fire where the flame of our love is kindled. But we have to get near enough for its sparks to fall on us." And that is what we're doing today, because the odds are stacked against us. Either we are suffering now, or we are going to suffer. And so we need to get near the cross and let those sparks fall on us. So friends, today, come with Mark and stand again at the foot of the cross. We're going to go to Mark chapter 15, starting at verse 16, and listen to that great storyteller that Mark is. And as we do, there'll be reflections, and every now and then we'll stop for a moment of quiet. Then we will sing a song or a hymn and help the message to grow deep. And though the words that you'll be able to see of the reading are on the screen, you may just find it helpful to have a Bible at hand. But first, we begin with a prayer and an opening song. Let's pray. Lord Jesus Christ, on this sacred and solemn day, open our eyes to see again the depth and mystery of redeeming love. Help us to follow where you go, to stop where you stumble, to listen when you cry, to hurt as you suffer, to bow our heads in sorrow when you die, so that when you are raised to life again, we may share your endless joy. Amen.
come and see the King of love. See the purple robe and crown of thorns he wears. Soldiers mock, boomers sneer, as he lifts the cruel cross. Lone and friendless now he climbs towards the hill. We worship at your feet, where wrath and mercy meet, and a guilty world is washed by love feels free. For us he was made sin, oh help me take it in. Deep wounds of love cry out, Father, forgive. I worship the Lamb who was slain. Come and weep, come and mourn, for your sin that held him there, so much deeper than the wounds of thorn and nail. All our pride, all our greed, all our fallenness and shame, and the Lord has laid his punishment on him. We worship at your feet, where wrath and mercy meet, and a guilty world is washed by love feels free. For us he was made sin, oh help me take it in. Deep wounds of love cry out, Father, forgive. I worship the Lamb who was slain. Man of heaven, born to earth, to restore us to your hand. Here we bow in awe beneath your searching eyes. From your tears comes our joy, from your death our life shall spring. By your resurrection power we shall rise. We worship at your feet, where wrath and mercy meet, and a guilty world is washed by love feels free. For us he was made sin, oh help me take it in. Deep wounds of love cry out, Father, forgive. I worship the Lamb who was slain.
Well, as we come to Mark 15 and verse 16, just remember that this is the morning after the night before. And what a night it had been. There was the meal, the way they'd celebrated the judgment on Egypt, the lives saved by the lamb that was killed, and God's people going free. Then came the warnings. One of you will betray me. Truly I tell you, before the cock crows again, you will deny me 3 times. Oh, Jesus knew what was coming. And that might explain the depression. As Jesus pours his heart out, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Jesus is going into the darkness. And so comes the prayer. Abba, Father, everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. But for the Son of God, as for us, not the easy answer. And then comes the arrest, the kiss, not of costly love, but cheap treachery. This is the man, seize him. And then, for all the boasting, comes the desertion. Only hours before, so full of confidence, I'll never betray you. But in the gloom of the garden, with the swords and the clubs flashing, courage flees, and so do they, every single one of them. So comes the first trial, the lying witnesses, the angry priests, the spitting and the punching, the jostling, and then the denial. Jesus looks up and sees him by the fire, and Peter is saying, "Him? Never seen him before." Then the second trial, Pilate wily and circling, looking for a way out. The priests, more cunning still, stirring up the crowd, "Crucify." And then the flogging. The whip of leather lashes, studded with bits of bone and metal. The victim stripped, tied to a pillar, beaten until the flesh of his back is in shreds. For many, they died from that alone. So as we come to hear the reading, consider Jesus. Naked and bleeding, he can barely stand. Humiliated, every nerve ending burning with pain. Unjustly condemned, deserted by the people he loved. No one stayed. What state must he have been in?
The soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, that is the praetorium, and called together the whole company of soldiers. They put a purple robe on him and twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him. And they began to call out to him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Again and again they struck him on the head with a staff and spat on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him.
Hundreds of men. That was what a company of soldiers was, anything between 200, 600 of them, with loud voices swearing and laughing and cursing. After all, they're soldiers. That's what soldiers do. And at the front is a man, naked, maybe with nothing but a loincloth. Somebody finds an old purpley robe, like a king might wear, and then a crown, not of gold, but thorny branches. Somebody digs out an old stick. It looks a bit like a king's sceptre, but instead of giving it to him, they start whacking him round the head with it. Not so much to hurt, but to make a joke of it. He's not worth taking seriously, this pathetic little Jew. Call himself a king? He is out of his mind. So, the one who saw creation's dawn, who spun the galaxies into life, is jostled and mocked and beaten by his own creatures. This is humiliation. This is terrible.
A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. Then they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it.
The soldiers did not offer epidurals or morphine, but they did have some wine mixed with myrrh, a drug to dull the pain. After all, it could take days for the victim to die, and who would want that? But Jesus says, no. Again, he chooses the narrow way, the narrow gate, the way of the cross, like he always did. For months now, time and again, he told his disciples what was coming. 3 times in Mark's Gospel, he warns them, I will be rejected, betrayed, mocked, spat upon, flogged, and nailed to a cross. So many times he said it, and they did not hear it. Then, that day when James and John, they wanted the best seats in the kingdom, and Jesus told them, the Son of Man came to be a slave and to give his life for many. And then hours before in Gethsemane, he chose again, yet not my will, but yours be done. And so the one who walked on water, who raised a little girl from the dead, who commanded the storm, fed the thousands, overcame a legion of demons, he did not need to be there, but he chose. No wine, no myrrh. He chose the cross.
Oh, to see the dawn of the darkest day, Christ on the road to Calvary, tried by sinful men, torn and beaten then, nailed to a cross of wood. There's the power of the cross. Christ became sin for us, took the blame, all the wrath we stand forgiven at the cross. Oh, to see the pain written on your face, bearing the awesome weight of sin. Every bitter thought, every evil deed, crowding your blood-stained brow. There's the power of the cross. Christ became sin for us, took the blame, all the wrath we stand forgiven at the cross. Now the daylight gleams, now the ground beneath wakes as its maker bows his head. Curtain torn in two, dead are raised to life, finished the victory cry. There's the power of the cross. Christ became sin for us, took the blame, all the wrath we stand forgiven at the cross. Oh, to see my name written on the wood, for through your suffering I am free. Death is crushed to death, life is mine to live, won through your selfless love. There's the power of the cross.
And they crucified him. Dividing up his clothes, they cast lots to see what each would get. It was the third hour when they crucified him.
The third hour. To you and me, that's 9 in the morning. You see, for the Jews, the day began at 6 at sunrise, and the third hour was 9. And it was then that they did it. Mark just uses the word crucified. He didn't need to explain, because his hearers, his readers, they knew what it looked like. They'd seen men and women die that way. First, attached to the crossbeam by rope or by nails. With Jesus, we know it was nails, because in John's Gospel it mentions the nail marks. Next, the victim's feet nailed to a little plank on the upright. That allowed them to push themselves up to breathe, make the dying last that little bit longer. It's a physical suffering we can barely begin to imagine. And then the main upright beam is dropped into place. The victim is hoisted up for all to see, again utterly naked. So not just in pain, but ashamed. Even in our day, where nakedness is so common in every magazine or film, we still prefer to hide our bodies when we have that choice. But Jesus had given it up.
The written notice of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." They crucified 2 robbers with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "So, you are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days? Come down from the cross and save yourselves." In the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law mocked him among themselves. "He saved others," they said, "but he can't save himself. Let this Christ, this King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe." Those crucified with him also heaped insults on him.
Mockery from every side. The written notice. Pilate didn't believe it. He knew that this man was not that kind of king at all. Then there are the passers-by, the religious leaders, even the criminals on either side of him. They hate him and despise him. He's not just alone. This man is loathed. And maybe we shouldn't be too hard on them. After all, their own Bibles told them in the book of Deuteronomy, "Cursed is the one who dies on a tree." And that is what happened to Jesus. Cursed by God, surely. It didn't say much for all those fancy claims he'd made. When he spoke and talked like he was God, forgiving sins and doing miracles. Or when he condemned the temple, said it was fruitless like a withered fig tree. Or when he promised he'd be raised from the dead. Where are his bold words now? Yet, if only they knew. Surely Mark wants us to hear more in what they're saying. He saved others, but he can't save himself. Exactly. He can't save himself. They didn't know how true that was. To save others, he has to stay there. And that's why he was there. Remember the supper, the Passover like no other. My body, my blood for you. And remember in the Passover, the lamb dies so others can be saved instead of others. And remember the words that he spoke. The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many.
He was pierced for our transgressions, and bruised for our iniquities, and to bring us peace like sheep have gone astray, turned each one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. We like sheep have gone astray, turned each one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all.
At the 6th hour, darkness came over the whole land until the 9th hour.
"3 hours, from 12 noon until 3 in the afternoon. Something awesome and inexplicable. You know this if you've ever been to the Mediterranean. 12 until 3, that is the hottest, brightest hour of the day. The sun beats down, but not on that day. Instead, darkness. Could it be clearer? Something unparalleled is going on. The heavens are just not behaving the way they should. And yet, maybe to Jews steeped in the Old Testament, it was not so puzzling, or certainly not afterwards as they reflected. Because there had been days, hadn't there, before, when the sky went dark. Way, way back, in Egypt, in the days of Moses, when God's judgment came on Pharaoh and on his people, there was thick darkness. And more. You go back to the old prophets like Amos or Joel or Zephaniah. They talk about darkness descending when God leaves, when God is angry in his justice, judging his people. But here the mystery deepens, because Jesus is the innocent, sinless one, and yet he's being judged. Did he not say that he would be the judge? But he also said he'd be the ransom, to pay the price, not for himself, but for the many. The judge, judged in our place. Martin Luther, the old reformer, he said that in that moment, the merciful Father and the beloved Son were working together. The Father heaping all the sin of the world onto Jesus, as if he was saying, "You be Peter, the denier. You be Paul, the persecutor, the blasphemer, the assaulter. Be David, the adulterer. Be the sinner who ate the apple in paradise. Be the thief on the cross. In short, be the person of all people, the one who has committed the sins of all humanity, and you bear them all." No wonder the story goes on.
And at the 9th hour, 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?"
We cannot touch the depths of this moment. Here is the cup that Jesus shrank from. The one thing he did not want to do, "Not my will, but yours," he prays. In some mysterious way, could it be God recoiling from the sin of the world, turning his face from the beloved? Or did it just feel that way, seem that way to Jesus? Who of us can really say? All we know is this: Jesus is alone, in a way never before and never since. And please God, this never happens to us. You see, for us, however awful life gets, God never withdraws from us. He never takes away all the goodness, all the blessings. But imagine a place where there are none. No God, no life, no truth or beauty or goodness or love. Instead, eternal coldness and darkness and evil, utterly forsaken. And how much more awful would it be for the one who had always lived in the warmth and the closeness of a relationship with his loving Heavenly Father, known a love like you and I could only begin to imagine? I wonder, have you ever been abandoned by someone you really loved? If you have, perhaps you have the tiniest glimpse of what Jesus was going through.
You were broken that I might be healed. You were cast off that I might draw near. You were thirsty that I might come drink. Cried out in anguish that I might sing. How deep is your love? How high and how wide is your mercy? How deep is your grace? Our hearts overflow with praise to you. You knew darkness that I might know light, wept great tears that mine might be dried, stripped of glory that I might be clothed, crushed by your Father to call me your own. How deep is your love? How high and how wide is your mercy? How deep is your grace? Our hearts overflow with praise. How deep is your love? How high and how wide is your mercy? How deep is your grace? Our hearts overflow with praise to you.
When some of those standing near heard this, they said, "Listen, he's calling Elijah." One man ran, filled a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a stick and offered it to Jesus to drink. "Now, leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down," he said. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom.
The curtain torn in two. Like with the darkness that day, there's more going on here than meets the eye. And notice this is in the temple, that place that was all leaves and no fruit, according to Jesus. It was going to wither as surely as the fig tree. And it's there that something amazing happens. A curtain that is 90 foot high, heavy and thick, you can imagine a curtain like that, is torn in two from the top to the bottom. What does it mean? Well, Bible students say it could mean a couple of things. It could be a sign of God's judgment. Is it like what people used to do in Bible times? When they were really upset, they would tear their clothes. And is there something of that here? As if God is saying with his heart full of grief, enough! This is no longer my house. I am leaving. If you want true sacrifice, go to my Son at the cross. Is it judgment? Or could it be God's invitation? As it were, is he peeling back the curtain so we can go in? As if to say, my Son has done it. The ransom is paid. The victory is won. The final sacrifice has been offered. Now come on in. Come into my presence. Whichever it is, whether it is God, as it were, leaving the temple or us coming near, surely it is a new beginning. It shows us now Jesus is the place where we can meet with God, where we can find a welcome. Jesus has opened the way to the Father, and now you and I can come home.
And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus heard his cry and saw how he died, he said, surely this man was the Son of God.
This is stunning. So far, no one in Mark's Gospel had got quite there, actually called Jesus the Son of God. Well, actually there were two voices that had said this. The demons sometimes said it, and the other one, of course, was the voice from heaven, God himself. The demons knew, but so much more wonderfully, God has spoken those beautiful words, my beloved Son. At Jesus' baptism, and then on that day, transfigured on the mountain, both times God had owned him as my Son. And now here, a pagan soldier says it, sees that somehow God is here. Now, of course, we don't know how much he really understood, but somehow he'd seen enough deaths before to know something different about this one. In some amazing way, in the tortured figure on the cross, he saw a glimpse of God. It's gobsmacking, isn't it? After all the healings and the miracles and the glory, where in Mark's Gospel do we really see God's Son? In the humiliation, God is there. In the bleeding and the suffering, God is there. In the failure and the weakness, God is there. In the pain and the darkness and the dying, God is there. Surely this man was the Son of God. The cross is the blazing fire where the flame of our love is kindled, but we have to get near enough for its sparks to fall on us. Friends, I wonder what sparks fall on you this afternoon as we gaze at the cross. And I wonder what falls for you. 3 particularly fall for me. Here's the first one. God knows. He knows. In our suffering, we are never, never alone. There is one with us who always knows. I don't know about you, but when I'm going through tough times, there is nothing worse than somebody coming out with those platitudes. It'll be fine. I know it's hard. Don't worry. And I want to say, you don't. You don't really know. But friends, here is somebody who really does know. Listen to some words of John Stott once again. He says this, I could never myself believe in God if it were not for the cross. The only God I believe in is the one the philosopher Nietzsche ridiculed as God on the cross. In the real world of pain, how could one worship a God who was immune to it? I have entered many Buddhist temples in different Asian countries. I've stood respectfully before the statue of the Buddha, with his legs crossed, his arms folded, his eyes closed, and the ghost of a smile playing around his mouth, a remote look on his face, utterly detached from the agonies of this world. But each time, after a while, I've just had to turn away. And in my imagination, instead I've turned to that lowly, twisted figure on the cross, nails through his hands and feet, his back lacerated, his limbs wrenched, his brow bleeding from the thorn pricks, his mouth dry, intolerably thirsty, plunged into God-forsaken darkness. That is the God for me. He knows. But more, the cross shows us he loves. This God loves. Consider again that all that Jesus went through, he chose that day. He went there with his eyes wide open. I wonder if, like me, you sometimes look back on your life and think, how glad I am that years ago I didn't know some of the tough times that were round the corner. Actually, knowing what's coming so often makes things worse. There's far more worry, far more of a burden in our hearts. Well, Jesus had that burden, and still he went there. What is it that makes somebody do that? The Apostle Paul put it this way to his friends in Galatia. The Son of God loved me and gave himself for me. And then later on to his friends in Rome, he put it this way. God, who didn't spare his own Son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not graciously also give us all things? Do you hear what Paul is saying there? He's saying if God loved us enough to do all that for us on Good Friday, he will not give up on us now. Imagine for a moment somebody loved you and promised you a fortune, millions of pounds, and you said, oh, just before then, I could really do with just a little bit. I need to buy a meal. Well, you'd be pretty confident, wouldn't you, that they wouldn't begrudge you the price of a meal. And why? Because you know when they're giving you so very much, the most costly thing, you don't need to worry about the small things along the way. And if God loved us that much on the cross, we can rely on his love for the future. This God not only knows, but he loves. He loves you like no one ever has, no one ever will. This God knows, he loves, and finally, he saves. This God saves. That is why the torn curtain and the centurion's cry are so important, because they show us that in the deepest and darkest moment on the cross, God is at work. And how do we know it? Well, we know it because of what happened 3 days later. As the ground rumbled and the stone began to grate and to move, Jesus was alive. Because despite all that evil could throw at Jesus, all the desertion and depression, the mockery, the torture and the death, still on that cross, Jesus was saving others. That's what the God of the cross does. He saves. And friends, is that not the place to finish? The cross gives us this amazing assurance that suffering and death and hell do not have the last word. There is a God who saves. Saves by coming among us, sharing our suffering to the deepest pit, and still he wins. Isn't that a massive encouragement in our sufferings? However painful, however deep, even on the day we die, God is at work, saving and overcoming. I guess some of you will know that Dutch lady in the Second World War, Corrie ten Boom. She spent years in a Nazi concentration camp with her sister Betsy. Betsy died there in Ravensbrück. Corrie survived. But as she was dying, Betsy said this to her sister Corrie. "Tell them, Corrie," she said, "there is no pit so deep, but he is not deeper still." Well, we don't actually need Betsy ten Boom to tell us that. The cross tells us that once and for all, loud and clear. In whatever evil or suffering we go through, there is a God who is deeper still. He knows, he loves, he saves. And through the centuries, along with the centurion, we too can cry out, surely this man was the Son of God.
Oh, precious sight, my Saviour stand, dying for me with outstretched hands. Oh, precious sight, I love to gaze, remembering salvation's day, remembering salvation's day. Oh, my eyes linger on this scene, in passing time and years not steal, the power which it impacts me, the freshness of its mystery, the freshness of its mystery. May I never lose the wonder of the cross. May I see it like the first time, standing as a sinner lost, undone by mercy and left speechless, watching wide-eyed at the cross. May I never lose the wonder of the cross. Behold the God-man crucified, the perfect sinless sacrifice, as blood ran down those nails of wood. History was split in two, yet still
indeed, may we never lose the wonder of the cross. We're going to come to some closing prayers now this afternoon. Would you please join with me in the words in bold type? By the nails through your hands and feet, give comfort to the suffering. Hear us, Lord Christ. By the crown of thorns upon your head, give hope to the despairing. Hear us, Lord Christ. By the spear that pierced your side, give courage to the heartbroken. Hear us, Lord Christ. By your being scorned and rejected of men, give love to the lonely. Hear us, Lord Christ. By your time of forsakenness, embrace all who feel condemned. Hear us, Lord Christ. By your death on the cross, give us life which is eternal. Hear us, Lord Christ. By your passion, protect us. By your wounds, heal us. By your death, raise us up and bring us to life everlasting. May the life-giving cross be the source of all our joy and peace. Amen. Let us bless the Lord. Thanks be to God. Amen. Friends, thank you so much for joining with us this afternoon. May the Lord bless you this rest of Good Friday and always keep you near the cross.